I recently read a really interesting article about comic book rarity by Keston on the Collector Hub. I'll provide a link below in the description. And it got me thinking about my collecting habits over the years and actually how I like to look for comic books that are deemed hard to find or coming across comic books that I've just never seen before. Now, in this article, Keston does a really good job of breaking down what rarity is. And he also says that it's an overused term in comic book collecting, and I absolutely agree. Comic book collectors like to use the word rare to describe comic books that maybe aren't really truly rare. There aren't really that many comic books that we could really classify as truly rare. But sure, some comic books are hard to find. So for this video, I'm going to go over the top 10 rarest Marvel comic books from the Bronze Age, or from the 1970s. And when I mean rare, I'm going to qualify this. These are Marvel comic books from the 1970s or the Bronze Age that are hard to find in 9.0 or higher, or very fine near mint for you old veteran collectors out there. I'm also going to break this down by genres, not by specific title, because I find that the different genres kind of lump themselves well in terms of how hard they are to find. What I hope to do with this list is just to kind of give some exposure to some of these harder to find titles that I've spent looking for many years, and encourage some discussion on this kind of contentious subject of rarity and how it, what kind of factor it has towards the collectability of these comic books. Okay, let's jump right in. The first series I want to talk about are Marvel Treasury items, and this is an example of this. Now, surprisingly, the main run of this, Marvel Treasury Edition, lasted like 7 years and 28 issues, and they also published a lot of little one-shot issues. And while these aren't particularly hard to find, these are hard to find in high grade. And one of the reasons why is just simply the size of these things. I mean, look how big this thing is. This is probably one of the more better-known ones where actually Marvel and DC did one of their rare collaborations with Superman versus Spider-Man. And this was kind of a one-shot issue. And there's actually a special edition of this where they only printed 5,000, or they actually signed 5,000 copies. And I believe they were signed by Stan Lee and maybe Dick Giordano. Could be wrong there. These are great, but I used to have almost a complete run of the main run, but I've since gotten rid of them. And you know what? I'm okay with that, because the problem with these things is that they're big, they're bulky, they're kind of hard to store, hard to manage. I still have a few, but actually I have more DC than Marvel ones. But yeah, these are a lot of fun. This is the Superman Spider-Man where they actually fight in this issue. And I got an example of another one. And this is the last issue of the run. Superman and Spider-Man team up again. So again, Marvel and DC coming together to produce one of these special issues. Yeah, there you go. Marvel Treasury Edition. Pretty tough to find in high grade. Okay, number 9 in terms of scarcity or hard to find, I would call are these general humor satire comics. Now, there were essentially 3 titles to mention in the Bronze Age in the 1970s for Marvel. And a lot of them just contained reprints. One of the series is called ARG. It lasted 5 issues. And a lot of this stuff was kind of in response to the popularity of other kind of satire magazines at that time, especially Mad magazines. But for Marvel, a lot of these really didn't last very long. But ARG is a 5-issue series that is certainly kind of hard to find in really nice shape. This is the first issue. The next issue I want to show is, this is a copy of Crazy #1, which lasted only 3 issues, but these are just reprints of another humor, kind of superhero humor series that Marvel published in the 60s called Not Brand Act. But I do find that this 3-issue series is kind of tough to locate in high grade. This is issue #1. And the last kind of humor satire series I want to mention is Spoof. And this one actually did have original content, and this lasted 5 issues. And the first issue is great because it has an infinity cover. This is, if you know anything about TV during that time, there's Barnabas Collins from Dark Shadows. I believe those 3 characters in the back are from Room 222, or the Mod Squad, one of those, definitely could be wrong. 5 issues. Again, these kind of humor satire series just didn't last very long for Marvel. It seemed like Marvel at that time in the 70s was just putting out just a wide variety of different titles just in the hope to capture market share. The next format I want to mention are Marvel magazines, specifically Marvel horror magazines from the Bronze Age. This is a copy of Monsters Unleashed #1. And now, Marvel published some magazines like Savage Sword of Conan, which became immensely popular, and those are actually quite easy to find in high grade. However, they also published numerous horror magazines in the 70s, Monsters Unleashed, Dracula Lives, Vampire Tales, and Tales of the Zombie, and another one I'm going to show you right now. But these guys can certainly be hard to find in nice shape. I've sold most of mine or gotten rid of most of mine over the years, and that's one of the regrets of comic book collecting that I've had, some of the stuff that I parted over the years, and these monster magazines are certainly one of those items. And this is a Haunt of Horror #1. I always found this one to be kind of interesting just because the color strike on this is much different than the other monster magazines at that time, which were kind of more muted. But Haunt of Horror, again, a lot of these horror magazines really didn't last more than, I want to say, like a dozen issues. Some of them far less. They're fun to collect. A lot of the early issues actually have pretty good artwork and stories. They're all black and white. And yeah, Haunt of Horror #1. Coming in at #7 are horror reprint titles by Marvel in the 70s. Marvel printed a lot of horror titles in the 70s, and a lot of them were essentially reprints of their Atlas titles in the 50s. And so, as a result, I guess maybe these had lower print runs, or they just weren't widely as collected. Beware is a series that lasted 8 issues, and I believe it became Tomb of Darkness after that. This has a great werewolf cover, and I always find it kind of interesting how werewolves are portrayed quite differently in a lot of the different covers. And again, these are kind of hard to find in nice shape. And, unfortunately for collectors like me, they're certainly becoming more expensive and harder to locate. This is Chamber of Chills #23. The one thing I want to mention about this issue is that it's the last issue of this series. What's fairly common is last issues of series, or the later issues of any kind of series, especially like Bronze Age titles, are hard to find in high grade. Chamber of Chills, I don't know how, it lasted actually 23 issues. Certainly the last few issues are certainly harder to find in higher grade than the earlier issues, just in my experience. But I think that kind of goes in general with a lot of other comic book titles. This is a copy of Monsters on the Prowl #13. I'm showing this as an example just because it is a kind of giant size issue. DC at that time was actually publishing a lot of these 48 and 52 page issues, and Marvel did to a much more lesser extent. However, in the mid-70s, they would also publish giant size, which was 68 pages. But for a lot of Marvel series, they had 1 or 2 issues that were published a little more larger format, and this is Monsters on the Prowl #13. So I kind of like these larger format books, and again, like these, horror reprint titles are like just some of my favorite from Marvel. I also want to show the last issue of Monsters on the Prowl. For a lot of these series, I have huge holes in them. I'm missing a lot of issues in between because I'm kind of picky in terms of the grade that I like. I should stop doing that, but years of conditioning have just made me just look for higher grade copies. But a nice copy of Monsters on the Prowl #30, which is the last issue. The last horror reprint title I want to show is Tomb of Darkness #9. This is actually the first issue of this series. As I mentioned earlier, I showed you a copy of Beware. Beware lasted, I believe, 8 issues, and then I think it became Tomb of Darkness. But this happened quite a bit with a lot of their titles, like Monsters on the Prowl, which I showed you before. I think might have been either Chamber of Darkness or Tower of Shadows, one of those 2 titles. I think it was a way for Marvel just to kind of mix it up for readers out there. But yeah, Tomb of Darkness #9, one of the more difficult runs, I would say, to find in nice shape. Now, how did I come up with this list? Well, some of it's actually just based on personal collecting history, what I found over the years to be hard to find in terms of these Marvel titles from the 1970s. I like collecting Marvel comics from the Bronze Age or the 1970s. It's kind of my happy area of collecting, if you want to say. And a lot of this is based on my personal experience. That being said, I've also used mycomicshop.com, and why I use this website is because they're considered to be one of the largest online retailers for back issues of comic books. They have a very wide selection of comic books, and nope, they're not sponsoring me, but one thing that they also do that's also very handy is that they provide current eBay links to a comic book on their website. And this, I believe, gives a pretty good indicator as to a comic book's availability. Okay, so here's an example. Let's say I want to find a particular issue of Marvel Treasury Edition. I can go on their website. They'll have a list of issues that are in stock, as well as the condition of them, as well as links to current eBay listings or auctions that have these items available. Next on the list, Marvel Bronze Age Westerns. These are hard to find in high grade and 9.0 and above. Now, believe it or not, I think at one time in the 70s, Marvel actually published 10 different Western titles in one calendar year. Yes, like that sounds kind of crazy, but that's how popular Westerns were back then. Like Westerns were a dominant genre in comic book industry in the 1950s and 1960s, and up until I guess the early 1970s. Gunhawks, which I believe lasted 7 issues, teamed up Reno Jones and Kid Cassidy, and these were actually original stories. Interestingly, issue number 7, which I don't own, is just titled Gunhawk, and that's for a particular reason, because, well, one of them gets bumped off in number 6. But an interesting series. Marvel also did a lot of reprint Western titles, and Ringo Kid, I just love the title, is one of them that actually lasted quite a few issues, but most of these were kind of reprints. But Ringo Kid, that's the first issue. There were also the Outlaw Kid. And again, these had great covers. Some of these had really nice covers by like Severin and like Gil Kane and whatnot. But I believe this was predominantly just reprints, Western reprints. Marvel had so many titles with the word Western in them. And Western Gunfighters this is the first issue of Western Gunfighters, which I believe had new stories as well as reprints. Ghost Rider, The Man from Fort Wrangel, The Renegades, and Gunhawk. One of the tougher series to locate in nice shape is a 5-issue run called The Western Kid. And I do like this series in particular because it features this Western hero with his dog. But it lasted 5 issues. This is actually the only issue that I have, and it's the first issue. But the other issues in this run are hard to locate. And we have Western Team Up number 1, featuring Rawhide Kid and the Dakota Kid. This was essentially almost just like a one-shot. It only lasted 1 issue. And one of the tougher first issues to find in high grade, in my opinion. And the last one I want to show you is Gunslinger number 3. Interestingly, the first issue was Tex Dawson Gunslinger, and it has an amazing cover by Jim Steranko. But this only lasted 3 issues. Tex Dawson Gunslinger became Gunslinger with issue number 2. So this is actually the last issue of the run. Beautiful cover by Romita and Trimpe. Next on the list in terms of hard to find in high grade Bronze Age is the Hanna-Barbera titles. These came out more in the later 70s. And what makes these that much more difficult to find in high grade is that they were exclusively newsstand. Now, the direct market was just starting to form at this point, so there would not have been that many copies sent to the direct market, but all the Hanna-Barbera titles were exclusively newsstand only. And Marvel, I believe, obtained the rights from Charlton and started publishing the popular Hanna-Barbera titles. And this is an issue of Dynamite number 1. Now, first issues, it seems, are a lot easier to find in true high grade than the later issues of this run. So Hanna-Barbera titles, a lot of them didn't last very many issues, but certainly the later issues of all these runs are a lot harder to find in high grade. But this is a copy of Dynamite #1. One of my favorite all-time cartoons is the Flintstones, and I bet you maybe didn't know that Marvel actually had a Flintstones title in the 70s. Charlton actually had numerous different Flintstone titles before, just because the cartoon was immensely popular. But growing up, I watched the Flintstones all the time. Like at lunchtime, you run home, you watch the Flintstones. And this is a copy of #1. This is a copy of Laugh Olympics #1, which featured basically all the popular different Hanna-Barbera characters at this time. You have Scooby-Doo, Yogi Bear, Huckleberry Hound. I wondered, like, Captain Caveman. It's amazing. Like, it was... loved all, like, this kind of stuff is very nostalgic for me. So I really love this stuff. And lastly, a copy of Yogi Bear #1. Yogi Bear and Boo Boo. These in high grade can actually be a little expensive, especially if they're kind of graded. But this kind of stuff I used to just dig through in the cheapie bins. Like, a lot of the stuff that you're seeing right now have been purchased over the years. When I go through the cheapie 50 cent bins, back then they were like even quarter bins, because nobody wanted this stuff and it wasn't very collectible. And now some of this stuff has become somewhat collectible, popular, but on the most part, like when I was talking about those Western titles, like a lot of them just don't have any value because honestly, there aren't very many collectors who are interested in those books. But they're still kind of, fun to look for, especially when you come across them in high grade. It's like, wow, you never see this kind of stuff in high grade. Okay, now we're getting to the level where these books are truly scarce in high grade. And this next genre I'm going to talk about is what I would call teen humor. Now, I mentioned kind of humor titles before, like the general humor satire. This is kind of what I would call teen humor, and it's kind of like Archie comics. Like, the artwork is very similar to the Dan DeCarlo stuff, kind of style in Archie. And Marvel actually had a number of different titles in the 70s that had this kind of style. And this is one of them, Chili, which actually had a pretty good run. And these are like hard to find in any grade. Like, honestly, but especially in high grade, these are very, very tough. So when I come across this kind of stuff, although, you don't really see it that much. Because again, as I mentioned before, dealers don't typically bring this kind of stuff to conventions because, well, there's just not a lot of collector interest in them. But I do find these books really kind of neat and interesting. And Chili is one of the tougher Marvel runs to complete. And then you have Mad About Millie. So this is Millie, and she had a shorter run that kind of straddles the Silver Age and Bronze Age called Mad About Millie, and this is issue #7. In my opinion, maybe the toughest Marvel run to complete of these kind of teen humor books. And then you have Millie the Model. So Millie, the artwork changed to this kind of Archie-esque in the kind of later 60s and maintained all the way to like issue in the 200s. And these are very hard to find in nice shape. And the last kind of teen humor book I want to show is Harvey #6. I actually featured this in one of my previous episodes, but this is the last issue of Harvey and the hardest issue of the run to locate in high grade. But there you go. Neat stuff. So what is tougher than teen humor? That would be kid humor. This is a copy of Homer the Happy Ghost. Something you don't see that often in high grade. These are actually reprints. There was actually a title published in the 50s by Atlas called Homer the Happy Ghost, and I no doubt a complete ripoff of Casper the Friendly Ghost. I mean, come on. Like, can it be any more
obvious. Anyways, I think it lasted like 5 or 6 issues. I'm not even sure. But this is the first issue, Homer the Happy Ghost. This is a title that actually lasted, I believe, 12 issues. I'm going to show you, I think, issue number 12 next. But little kids, just when I remember coming across these at a convention that the dealer had, and we were talking about this, and he goes, he had never seen this before. And this was at a convention like 20 years ago. So even like 20 years ago, these were hard to find. This is issue number 9. And yeah, these are really hard to find in nice shape. This is issue number 12, which is the last issue. And it features Calvin, actually a new character created by Marvel at that time. Probably trying to capitalize on the popularity of Fat Albert and the Kids. An unusual kind of character, just capturing the cultural popularity at that time. Little Kids number 12, featuring Calvin. Probably the toughest run of these kind of what I call kids humor Marvel comics is Little Pals. And this is issue number 1. It lasted 5 issues. And this may be kind of like their only funny animal, well, outside of the Hanna-Barbera stuff, but what you would call kind of like funny animal titles in the 70s. I've been kind of on the hunt for this title for years. And sure, you can find these online, but never in nice shape. I prefer to kind of always look for comic books in the wild versus online, just because I just find it more fun that way. But anyways, Little Pals, number 1. And the last one I want to show you is Peter the Little Pest, number 1. This, I believe, lasted 4 issues, and these contain reprints similar to like Homer the Happy Ghost. This came out around the same time, and it only lasted, I believe, like 4 issues. A tough set to complete, and tough to find in nice shape.
I also wanted to show a few oddball items that don't necessarily fall into any particular genre, but they are kind of obscure or kind of hard to find in high grade, and they're certainly worth mentioning if we're talking about, hard to find Marvel stuff from the 1970s. The first one is Foom, which is Friends of Old Marvel. This was actually considered a fanzine. A lot of it has stuff by Jim Steranko inside. This is issue number 2. And these were only available through subscription, like through mail order. So it makes these particularly hard to find in nice shape. There's actually one issue that also previews the new X-Men, and it predates Giant Size X-Men number 1. And that one actually is quite valuable. These have some value, but, they're not really essentially a comic book. They're just a lot of articles to give you previews on what's to come, as well as other like fan-related stuff. And I really do love this Hulk cover by Steranko. The next item is these, which are actually not comic books, but they were digests, and they had full-text stories, but it was printed by Marvel. It only lasted 2 issues, and it's called Haunt of Horror. So this one's actually got a story by Denny O'Neil, but in the second issue, it's even got a story written by Harlan Ellison. So some pretty high-profile authors, really kind of oddball, interesting Marvel items from the 70s. Not easy to find in nice shape. Like my copies are also kind of like not that great, but pretty cool. Haunt of Horror. 2-issue kind of digests, almost kind of like a Reader's Digest size of horror stories. And the last couple items I wanted to show that are kind of not in the same vein, oddball items, are these what they call Fireside Edition Marvel books. And these are great if you ever come across these. And again, these are kind of like trade paperbacks from the 1970s before trade paperbacks became a thing. And these also had, introductions and other text supplements written by Stan Lee and other authors. This issue in particular is really good because it has kind of the profiles as well as comics featuring Doctor Doom, Loki, Dormammu, Mephisto, Green Goblin, all the big baddies from Marvel. Great stuff if you ever come across these. Kind of tough to locate in high grade, but very cool. With comic books, when you talk about rarity by itself and this is really important, does not make a comic book valuable. There has to be collector interest in that comic book in order for it to have any kind of value. And just because it's rare or hard to find doesn't mean that it has any value. But that being said, there are a lot of Marvel Comics completists out there who want to get an issue of everything. And sure, it's going to be hard to track down some of these issues, so you might have to pay a premium. But by and large, a lot of these titles, really, there are very few collectors out there that collect these titles, so the demand for these titles is very low. So if you go to a convention, odds are, well, dealers are not going to bring a lot of these books just because, well, they're not in demand. They're not going to sell. So that makes the challenge of finding these books that much more difficult.
All right, number 2. This is now, we're getting to the really heavy, hard stuff to find. And it's Marvel Romance. Now, there were 2 main Marvel Romance titles in the Bronze Age. One is Our Love Story, which lasted unbelievably 38 issues. And the other title was My Love. Now, the other title that's worth mentioning, which kind of is somewhat like romance, is Night Nurse. Because, well, if you read some of the stories, there are some romantic elements to it. But Night Nurse is just a weird comic book. And these have actually started to become expensive. I've kind of pretty much given up looking for high-grade copies of this stuff because, 1, they've become kind of expensive, and 2, they're just so hard to find in nice shape. So this is number 2. This is a copy of number 13, and this is kind of a special giant size issue. Again, like these square-bound books in high grade, tough to find, even regardless of whatever title, but Marvel Romance, oh man, very hard to find. I actually find like the covers of these to be great. A lot of them were done by John Romita. I'm going to show you one more cover, Our Love Story number 32. So yeah, like a lot of these romance books, very hard to find in nice shape, and they've become actually quite collectible in a sense. They become kind of expensive, hard to find.
Now, what could be more difficult to find than those Marvel 70s romance? Well, there's one category that's truly actually kind of rare when it comes to Marvel Bronze Age comic books. And that is this. Well, this kind of variant. This is actually what's known as a 35-cent variant of a Conan number 78. Now, what happened in the 70s is that with rapid inflation, Marvel was test pricing a lot of these price increases in a lot of different cities. Well, not a lot of different cities. In particular, 5 different cities in the US. So when the prices raised from 25 cents to 30 cents, before they raised the prices on all the comic books, they decided to test that price increase in a few areas to see how they did. And so there are what are called 30-cent price variants, and the more rare version, 35-cent variants. The 35-cent variants were used when they increased the price from 30 cents to 35 cents to see how they did. So in the case of 35-cent variants, they only did 5 cities, and I believe I'll list the 5 cities, over here. And so these were only available on newsstand, and only in those 5 cities, and they only printed so many of these. Now, these are actually kind of pricey, and depending on the book, in particular one famous book, which is Star Wars number 1, a high-graded copy of that can easily reach 5 figures, which is pretty crazy. So these books are actually, in my opinion, what you would call rare and high grade. Like legitimately rare and high grade. In some cases, some of these, like I think in particular, I can remember like Scooby-Doo number 1, which is a Hanna-Barbera title, which is already scarce to begin with. There's a 35-cent variant version of that. So that, in my opinion, is probably one of the rarest Marvel's comic books from the 1970s. I hope you enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun kind of coming up with this idea and breaking down the different genres in terms of their scarcity for the 1970s Marvel titles. This is particularly an area of Marvel Comics that I really like. And so I hope you find some of this interesting and useful, and maybe spark your interest in terms of looking for issues in these runs. And they're fairly short, so, who knows, you might get lucky. So there you go. the rarest Marvel comics from the 1970s. I hope you found this interesting. This is kind of like a, I don't know, like a strong interest area for myself. And I hope it kind of sparks some interest in looking out for these titles. Because, well, a lot of these titles are very short. So they're not, that onerous to kind of complete. Except if you want to find them in high grade. But yeah, it's kind of a fun little kind of corner of collecting comic books. Looking for these oddball titles. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and until next time, enjoy and read your comic books.